The invitation arrived in a thick cream envelope, elegant and innocent, as if it weren't about to detonate everything Eleanor Brooks thought she knew about love, loyalty, and her future. The gold-embossed lettering caught the soft morning light, spilling into her studio apartment in Chicago. A small sunlit space where canvases leaned against every wall and the scent of linseed oil lingered like a second skin. She opened it with a half smile, already assuming it was another gallery opening or an alumni wedding invite. But the moment her eyes landed on the names, her breath left her. Mr. and Mrs. Jameson Cordell request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their son, Richard Cordell, to Miss Morgan Avery. Her fingers trembled. The rest of the card blurred. The date, the venue in Napa, the handwritten note at the bottom from Morgan. Hope you'll be there. It wouldn't feel right without you. None of it made sense. Morgan, her best friend since college. Richard, the man she had spent 3 years planning a life with. The man who had told her he just needed time. Who had said, "It's not you, Elena. I just don't know what I want right now." He knew. He'd known all along. Her knees buckled and she sank onto the floor beside her easel, the thick cardstock crumpled in her palm. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, not quite sobs, not yet. The betrayal pressed down on her chest like a boulder. She had cried when Richard left her 6 months ago, citing confusion, distance, the usual vague words. She had leaned on Morgan, who offered comfort and wine and platitudes about how men didn't know what they wanted until it was too late. Morgan had known too. The realization was like acid. Her best friend and her ex-fiancé. A whole romance carried out in the shadows of Elena's grief. There was no confrontation, no screaming match. Just a silence so loud it fractured something inside her. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window with her sketchpad, scribbling until dawn. By morning, her art was covered in jagged black lines and broken shapes. Her chest ached with the weight of what had been stolen, not just the man she loved, but the trust she had placed in 2 people who had once been her whole world. The next evening, she packed a small bag with the essentials: 2 sketchbooks, a few changes of clothes, and a well-worn copy of Letters to a Young Artist. She booked the first flight she could find that wasn't to anywhere familiar, somewhere that didn't smell like Morgan's perfume or echo with Richard's voice. Charleston, South Carolina. She'd never been. It sounded warm, distant, old-fashioned. She didn't care. The plane touched down under a sky smeared with gold and purple. Charleston welcomed her with the scent of salt and magnolias, streets lined with pastel houses, and an unfamiliar softness in the air. It felt like a city out of time, slower, quieter, and somehow untouched by the kind of sharp modern pain that had gutted her. She checked into a modest guest house on Church Street and wandered the cobblestones, aimless but grateful to be somewhere else. She watched horse-drawn carriages pass by, children laughing in fountains, strangers sipping iced tea under ivy-covered balconies. It was the kind of place that whispered, "It's okay to start over." Still numb, she entered a tiny cafe tucked behind a row of art galleries. It smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. Inside, everything was wood and warmth, chalkboard menus, local paintings on the walls, a record player spinning soft jazz in the corner. She ordered a tea and sat by the window watching the world go on without her. "Is this seat taken?" a man's voice asked. She looked up. He was tall, lean, with hair just tousled enough to look effortless, and a quiet intensity behind storm-colored eyes. He wasn't striking in the way Richard had been. Richard had been all flash and charm. This man felt grounded, unapologetically, still, like the eye of a storm. She shrugged. "No." He sat across from her without another word. For several minutes they didn't speak. Then out of nowhere she said, "Have you ever had the people closest to you destroy you without a second thought?" He tilted his head. "Only once. It was enough." She blinked, surprised. "And what did you do?" "I left." He met her eyes. "Came here." She wanted to ask his story, but something about his expression said he wasn't ready to tell it. That was fine. She wasn't ready to tell hers either. They sat in companionable silence, 2 strangers nursing old wounds. When she rose to leave, he stood too. "Wait," he said. "Elena, right?" Her eyes narrowed. "How do you know my name?" "You dropped your receipt." He handed it to her, then hesitated. "I'm Theo." She took the receipt, unsure what else to say. He continued cautiously. "If you want to forget everything for a little while, Sometimes it helps to do something insane. Something so far from who you were that it shocks your system. She tilted her head. What are you suggesting? Let's get married. The words landed like thunder. She stared at him, mouth slightly open. I'm serious, he said, his voice calm. No strings, just one day, you and me. We pretend. We're people we're not. Start new, even if just for 24 hours. She laughed, the sound bitter. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Probably, he said. But maybe dumb is what we need. That night they stood in front of a sleepy officiant at a small chapel near the waterfront. She wore jeans and a blouse. He wore a button-down and tired eyes. There were no flowers, no music, no family. Theo looked at her like she wasn't broken, like she wasn't crazy for doing this. Do you, Elena Brooks, take this man? She didn't believe in forever anymore, but she believed in now. And right now this man was giving her something no one else had in weeks, space to be someone new. I do. He said it too, gently, firmly. And just like that, they were married. They walked out into the Charleston night, husband and wife in name only, the sound of the harbor behind them, the future wide open. Elena didn't know what she'd just done. All she knew was that her heart hurt a little less when she was with Theo. She had come to Charleston to escape. Instead, she had stepped into a story even she couldn't have painted. The morning after the wedding was quiet, suspended in a surreal calm that clung to the soft light coming through the tall windows of the guest house suite. Elena lay awake in a bed that wasn't hers, beneath unfamiliar sheets, listening to the muffled hum of Charleston streets starting their day. For a few moments, she allowed herself to forget. Then her gaze landed on the silver band on her finger, and reality settled over her like fog. They had done it. She had married a man she barely knew. No ceremony, no dress, no audience. Just whispered vows between strangers trying to outrun their pasts. She pulled on a sweater and padded out into the kitchen. The space was impossibly beautiful. Sunlight pouring through open French doors, spilling across a marble island and rich wooden beams overhead. She had assumed they'd rented a modest place for their temporary madness, but this was no ordinary rental. The details betrayed a quiet luxury. Custom cabinetry, espresso machines, art that hadn't come from discount chains. Theo stood by the counter already dressed, pouring coffee with a precision that made her pause. He glanced up, offered, a small, almost shy smile. Morning, morning, she murmured, her voice still rough with sleep. This isn't an Airbnb. He handed her a cup without answering. Whose place is this? She asked, more curious than accusatory. I have a few properties here, he said simply. Elena arched an eyebrow. You collect houses? He sipped his coffee, leaning against the counter. I collect quiet, places I can disappear. That answer didn't explain much, but she let it go. After all, she wasn't here for answers. They sat in the sun-drenched kitchen, the silence not as awkward as it should have been between two people who had exchanged vows the night before. A bird sang from a nearby tree. A breeze fluttered the white curtains. Did you mean it? She asked after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. Theo looked at her. Mean what? What you said yesterday. About needing something that shocks the system. About starting over. His gaze was steady. Every word. She believed him. And yet she couldn't ignore the part of her that still braced for disappointment. They made a pact over breakfast. 30 days. They'd stay married for a month. No obligations, no expectations. They'd spend time together, but no pressure to pretend anything more than what it was. A temporary escape. At the end of the 30 days, they'd go their separate ways, no questions asked. It was absurd, reckless. But that was the point. The agreement gave them both permission to breathe. Over the next few days, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings began with long walks along the Battery, where Theo pointed out hidden gardens and old bookshops tucked between colorful townhouses. Afternoons were spent wandering through art galleries or sipping wine in shaded courtyards. Elena sketched constantly, her hands rediscovering the freedom that pain had stifled. Theo read, listened, occasionally disappeared for a few hours with vague explanations about needing to check on things. They were, in every practical sense, strangers, and yet their time together held a strange intimacy, not physical, but emotional. There were no pretenses, no attempts to impress or seduce. Just two people unguarded enough to exist beside each other. One evening, they cooked dinner together. Theo insisted on making his grandmother's pasta recipe, and Elena found herself laughing as he fumbled through boiling water and overcooked garlic. They ate on the porch, the sun dipping below the trees, their laughter easing into comfortable silence. She asked him then, "Why Charleston?" Theo swirled the wine in his glass before answering. "It was the first place I ever came where no one knew who I was." "Who are you?" He glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Someone trying to remember." She didn't press him. She had her own ghosts. Elena began to notice things. The way he paused before speaking about himself. The restless way he tapped his fingers when the world got too quiet. The tension in his shoulders whenever his phone rang, though he always let it go to voicemail. He wasn't just escaping something. He was hiding from it. But she kept her questions to herself. That had been part of the pact too. One afternoon she found herself painting him. Not in deliberate strokes, but in the way artists do when their mind drifts. Shadows, shapes, a man standing alone at the edge of a dock, back turned to the world. When Theo saw it, he didn't say anything, just studied it for a long while, and murmured, "You see too much. You hide too much," she replied. Still, the boundaries between them began to blur. They weren't lovers, but they were no longer strangers. There was a gentleness to their days that felt sacred, as if neither wanted to break whatever fragile peace they'd constructed. Then came the night of the storm. The wind howled outside, rain slashing against the windows as thunder rolled in from the harbor. The power flickered once, twice, then died. They lit candles and sat on the living room floor, wrapped in blankets and flickering shadows. Elena looked at him across the candlelight. "Have you ever been in love?" Theo didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "Once. I thought I was, but it was built on expectations, on who she wanted me to be, not who I was." Elena nodded. She knew that story all too well. He looked at her then, really looked at her. "What about you?" "I thought I was," she said. "But now I wonder if I just wanted to believe in someone so badly, I didn't notice they were leaving me piece by piece." They sat with that truth between them, the storm roaring outside, the room flickering with candlelight. Theo reached out then, not to touch her, but to offer his hand. Just that. No pressure. No intent. She took it. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't sexual. It was human. For a moment, Elena forgot the hurt, the betrayal, the weight of everything she'd left behind. Here, in this quiet, stormlit moment, she found something rare. Peace, not happiness. Not yet, but peace. She didn't know where this strange, beautiful detour would lead. Maybe it would end exactly as they planned. 30 days and done. Maybe it would unravel with the truth they were still too afraid to share. But for now it was enough. She was Elena Brooks. He was Theo Weston. They were husband and wife by name only, but they were something else too. Two souls trying to remember who. They were before the world broke them, and somehow, in the space between pretending and possibility, they had started to build something real. The days that followed felt like they belonged to a different life. Charleston had become a quiet backdrop to something Elena never expected, a strange kind of sanctuary. Each morning began with the scent of sea air drifting through linen curtains, and each evening ended with quiet dinners and the kind of silences that didn't need to be filled. Their agreement still stood. 30 days, no expectations. But rules, Elena was learning, had a way of blurring when real emotions began to breathe between the lines. Theo was kind, effortlessly so. He made her laugh without trying. He didn't tiptoe around her pain like most people did. He didn't flinch when she went quiet for no reason or when she woke in the middle of the night unable to sleep. He never pressed for answers. It was both comforting and infuriating. But it was also confusing. There was an ease in their companionship that didn't feel accidental. The kind of ease that only came with truth. Or so Elena thought. It started with the wine. One afternoon, while rearranging some artwork in the sunroom, she opened the credenza to make space for her supplies and found rows of expensive wine bottles tucked carefully on mahogany racks. They were vintage, rare, the kind collectors spent fortunes to acquire. She wasn't an expert, but she knew enough to understand that the collection belonged to someone with wealth. Serious wealth. She brushed it off at first. Maybe he'd rented the house from someone rich. Maybe it was just part of Charleston's charm. But the clues began to stack like stones. Theo never flinched at the price of things. He carried himself with an understated assurance, the kind people develop not from arrogance, but from being born into rooms where they never had to ask twice. He dressed simply, but everything he wore was tailored. Eleanor began to notice the small monograms on his cuffs, the Swiss watch he never checked, the sleek black SUV with out-of-state plates that he claimed was a loaner, but had no visible rental markings. She began to wonder. Then came the envelope. She had been looking for a pencil sharpener in the desk drawer, nothing more, but instead she found a stack of papers. Thick paper, heavy stock, contracts, schedules, business documents addressed to a name that stopped her breath cold. Theodore Weston III. It didn't register immediately, but a few clicks on her laptop later, everything unraveled. Western Group, real, estate empire, billion-dollar holdings, coastal developments, private islands, eco-resorts, headlines, scandals, public feuds with board members, a recent disappearance from public life. No explanations. Her stomach turned. Theo, her quiet, thoughtful, gentle husband, was one of the most talked about men in the business world, and he had never said a word. The realization wasn't just betrayal. It was displacement. She didn't know who she was talking to at breakfast anymore. She didn't know if the conversations, the walks, the laughter, it had all been real, or if he had simply been performing for the sake of some emotional experiment. Elena stood in the doorway of the kitchen that night, her heart hammering as he stirred something on the stove. "You lied to me." Theo looked up, surprised. "What?" "You lied about who you are. About all of it." He set the spoon down slowly, turning to face her. "I didn't lie," he said softly. "I didn't tell you, but I never lied." "That's the same thing," she snapped. "You knew what I was escaping. You knew what I was running from, and you let me believe we were the same." He ran a hand through his hair. "I wasn't trying to trick you, Eleanor." She laughed, bitter. "You didn't think I'd find out? That I'd just believe some mysterious man with a perfect house and no job just happened to want to marry? A stranger in a cafe?" He stepped closer but stopped when he saw her flinch. "I left that world behind," he said. "I didn't want to be him anymore." "Then why are you still him?" she asked, gesturing to the papers, the wine, the car, the life. He didn't answer. She felt her chest cave inward, the hurt running deeper than she expected. It wasn't just that he'd hidden his name. It was the intimacy they'd built that now felt hollow, like a house made of glass. She needed air. She grabbed her keys and left. Charleston at night was cooler, quieter. The streets were wet from a passing rain, and the gas lamps gave the worlds a soft amber glow. Eleanor walked without direction, tears stinging her eyes. Not because she was in love, not yet, but because for the first time in months she had allowed herself to feel something close to safe, to hope. And now even that was gone. She wandered until her feet ached, then returned hours later to find the house dark. She entered quietly, unsure if he was still awake, but he was there, sitting in the sunroom, a glass of whiskey in hand, her painting propped up in front of him, the one she had drawn of him, back turned, standing on a dock. "I didn't know how to be anyone else around. You," he said, voice low. "So I tried to be no one." Elena crossed her arms, waiting. "I was engaged once," he continued. "Her name was Camille. She loved me, or said she did, until my father died, until the company became mine. Then it was like everything changed. I wasn't a person anymore, just an asset." He looked at the painting. "When I left, I didn't want anyone to recognize me. I didn't want to be pitied or chased. I just wanted to be me." "You still should have told me," she said quietly. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you'd see my name and think I was just another man with money trying to fix something by buying it." She didn't respond. They sat in silence. Eventually she asked, "Why me?" He looked up, startled. "What? Why me, Theo? Why ask a stranger to marry you in a cafe?" He leaned back. "Because you look like someone who didn't care who I was. And because in that moment I saw something familiar in your eyes, something broken." She swallowed hard. "I didn't want to fix you," he said. "I just wanted to be with someone who didn't ask me to be anything." Eleanor's voice was quiet. "But that's what we do, isn't it? We ask each other to be more than we are." He nodded slowly. "I just hoped you'd want me anyway." She stood there for a long time, watching him. Something in her softened, but only a little. The truth had been revealed. But the cracks remained. Trust, she knew, was not restored by confession alone. It had to be rebuilt, and that took more than 30 days. That night she didn't leave, but she didn't sleep beside him either. She took a blanket to the guest room and closed the door. Outside, the rain returned, a slow, steady rhythm against the windows. Inside, two people sat on opposite ends of the same house, wondering what to do with a truth that had come too late. The silence between Elena and Theo grew heavier in the days that followed. It wasn't the charged kind of silence that came from passionate arguments or stifled emotions. It was the kind that settled into corners, soaked into furniture, and echoed in footsteps. It made the house feel colder, despite the sun that still warmed the Charleston mornings. Elena spent more time in the garden now, avoiding the main rooms of the house where the shadows of their conversations lingered. She painted in the sunroom only when Theo wasn't around, her brushstrokes sharper, her color palette darker. The peace they had once shared felt like a dream she wasn't sure had ever really belonged to her. Every time she looked at him now, all she could see was the face of a man who had hidden something fundamental, even if his reasons had been born from fear and not malice. Theo tried, in quiet ways. He brought her coffee without speaking. He left space for her to move, to process, never demanding or pleading. But there was a distance in his eyes now too, as though he had accepted her absence before she had physically left. It wasn't just the truth he'd concealed. It was the foundation of everything they'd started to build, however strange and impulsive it had been, that now felt unstable. The morning everything changed, Charleston woke under a soft mist, the kind that made the city feel like it was suspended in time. Eleanor had gone out to trim the creeping jasmine along the stone path that led to the side gate, determined to occupy her hands and avoid the suffocating quiet. She wasn't paying attention to her footing on the slick flagstones. One misstep, a turn too fast, and the world tilted beneath her. Her scream was brief, then silence. The pain came next, white hot and immediate, as she crumpled to the ground, her ankle twisting under her and her wrist landing hard on the edge of the pathway. She tried to sit up, but the pain seared through her arm and ribs. The sky above spun in uneven spirals. Before she could call out, a shadow appeared over her. "Elena!" Theo's voice broke through the haze, full of panic, a sound she hadn't heard in his voice before. He dropped to his knees beside her, eyes wild, hands unsure where to touch. "Don't move," he said quickly, already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No, I'm fine," she muttered, even as the world continued to spin. "You're not fine," he said sharply. "You hit your head." "I didn't." She started, but then her vision blurred again and she leaned against him, weak and dizzy. She didn't protest after that. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights hummed above them while doctors moved with practiced urgency. Eleanor was barely conscious by the time they rolled her into imaging. Theo paced the hallway, hands buried in his hair, eyes fixed on the door that had swallowed her. It felt wrong, not being able to do anything. For a man used to solving problems with decisions, investments, strategy, this helplessness was unbearable. Hours passed. The scans came back. Clean. No concussion, no internal bleeding, but her wrist was fractured and her ankle sprained. The doctor said she'd been lucky. Another angle, a harder fall, and it might have been worse. Theo didn't leave her side. He held her hand when she came to, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in slow rhythmic motions. She didn't pull away. Maybe it was the medication. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't seen anyone look at her like that in so long. Back at the house, she slept for almost an entire day. Theo stayed close but never intrusive. He worked quietly from the corner of the room, made her food, helped her shower, braided her hair once when she was too sore to lift her arms. One evening, she woke to find him in the living room with a small hardcover book in his hands, reading aloud. His voice was low, steady, warm. He didn't know she was listening. And so the ocean, in all its wild, unknowable vastness, still returns faithfully to the shore. Every day, no matter the storm. She didn't speak, just lay there, eyes closed, letting the sound of his voice wrap around her like a balm. Days blurred, and with them, the edges of her anger softened. He hadn't lied about everything. He hadn't tried to buy her or manipulate her. He had offered her space, asked for nothing, and when she had needed him most, he had come without hesitation. Still something lingered, unspoken but present. One afternoon she asked, "Did you ever think about telling me the truth?" Theo looked up from the book in his lap. He didn't pretend not to understand. Every day. Then why didn't you? He closed the book, staring out at the garden. Because I was terrified that the only reason you liked me was because you didn't know who I was. She waited. When I'm Theo Weston, he said slowly, people assume. They want something. Or they hate me for things I didn't do. And when I found you, I thought, maybe I could just be Theo. Just the man. You didn't think I could handle it? I didn't think I could handle losing you. His words landed with a weight that settled in her chest. I was going to tell you, he added. But every day that passed, it felt harder. Because you smiled more. You relaxed. You began to trust me. And I knew the moment I said it, all of that would break. He looked at her then, vulnerability etched into every line of his face. I didn't want to break you. Eleanor looked down at her wrapped wrist. You didn't. You just reminded me that even the kindest lies leave bruises. He nodded. I deserve that. But this time, she didn't walk away. She reached for her sketch pad, one of the few things she kept close now that movement was limited. Her hand was slower, but the image came quickly. A man standing on a shoreline, arms outstretched facing the wind. I want to believe you, she said. Theo took the pad, studied the drawing. His eyes softened. I want you to, he replied. But I'll wait until you do. They didn't speak for a while. The sky outside darkened, the first stars blinking into life above Charleston. Inside the house, the silence changed. It wasn't full of grief or distance anymore. It was full of possibility. Trust wouldn't return overnight. Forgiveness, Eleanor knew, was a long road. But in that quiet moment, she also knew something else. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to be. The sunlit days passed more gently now, as if Charleston itself was aware of the delicate truce that had formed between Elena and Theo. Though their silences were still weighted with the unspoken, past hurts, exposed truths, and the fragile possibility of healing, there was a newfound softness in the way they moved around each other, a cautious grace. Neither of them used the word forgiveness, but it hovered between them in the way he adjusted her pillows at night and the way she no longer flinched when their fingers accidentally touched. Elena's recovery brought a slower pace to their lives. She was forced to rest, to pause, which was foreign to her. Resting gave space for thoughts to echo louder than before. She would sit near the sunroom's window, sketchpad in her lap, watching the light change across the garden. Sometimes she would draw. Other times she would simply think. About the past, about Theo, about what it meant to be seen in both truth and vulnerability. Theo kept his distance but never strayed far. He spent time in the garden when she was indoors, spoke softly when entering rooms, cooked meals he wasn't sure she'd eat but prepared them anyway. The house had grown quieter but not in an empty way. It was the silence of something still, mending like a broken bone learning how to bear weight again. And then the envelope arrived. Elena found it on the kitchen counter one morning while reaching for tea. A standard white envelope, unassuming except for the crisp lettering of Western Group printed in the top left corner. Curiosity tugged at her. She wasn't snooping. Theo had left it in plain sight. But when she opened it, the contents stole her breath. Flight itineraries, legal briefings, memos from board members, schedules for meetings in New York and London. A detailed plan of Theo's upcoming business engagements, all marked within the same period he'd told her he was here in Charleston for clarity. The documents were dated across weeks during which he'd claimed to have stepped away from that life. She sat down, the paper trembling in her hands. It wasn't that he was involved with Western Group. That she could have forgiven. What struck her deeper was that he had still been managing it while pretending he wasn't, while comforting her, while promising presence, honesty. He had split himself down the middle and shown her only the half that looked like healing. When Theo entered the room a few minutes later, her face gave everything away. Elena, he started, cautious. How long? She asked, holding up the paper. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. Since the second week. So the moment I started trusting you. He moved closer. I didn't lie. You hid. Again. I tried to step away, but when the board threatened to dissolve the South Asia contracts, she stood, her chair scraping back. You don't owe me business justifications, Theo. You owe me the truth. He was quiet for a long moment. I was scared, he admitted, that if I let everything go at once, I'd lose the last pieces of who I am. I wasn't ready. You should have told me that. You should have let me choose whether I wanted to stay knowing that. His shoulders sagged. I wanted to be the version of myself that didn't need saving. I wanted to show you what it looked like when I wasn't trying to juggle the weight of the world. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. You don't get to edit yourself into someone who's safe and clean and ready, she whispered. You either show up whole, or you don't show up at all. That night, she packed slowly, folding her things into the small suitcase she'd barely touched since arriving. Theo didn't stop her. Maybe because he knew he couldn't. Maybe because he understood that sometimes love isn't about staying. It's about walking away before trust corrodes completely. She didn't go far. Just back to her apartment in Chicago, to her sunlit studio that now felt both too small and too full of memories. The walls still held traces of a woman she no longer was. She stood at the window, watching the lake ripple in the distance, and wondered what it meant to start over after trying to start over already. A week passed in quiet routine. She painted obsessively, the act more about survival than creation. She turned off her phone, ignored messages, refused invitations. But one morning, an unusual nausea pulled her from bed earlier than usual. It lingered throughout the day. By evening, it returned with a weight she couldn't shake. 2 days later, the pregnancy test blinked in soft digital confirmation. Positive. Elena sat on the bathroom floor, her back against the door, hands wrapped around her knees. Her world didn't spin this time. It stilled. Like the moment between heartbeats. Like the inhale before a storm. She hadn't cried when she left Theo. She cried now. Not because of fear, but because of knowing. Knowing that this child would bind her forever to a man who had both saved and broken her. Knowing that motherhood wasn't something she had planned, especially not like this. And knowing too that love could still be real, even when the people in it were flawed. She thought of Theo, his quiet patience, his flaws, the truth he had buried not out of malice, but out of fear. She thought of the nights they had shared, not the impulsive wedding, but the soft moments afterward, reading aloud, his hand on hers in sleep, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. And then she thought of the child, hers, theirs, not a symbol of a mistake, but of something that had happened between two broken people trying to be whole again. The next morning she opened her laptop, not to write a letter, not to beg or accuse, but to begin a new painting. She started with a horizon, then a figure standing in the center of the canvas, hands over his chest, facing a bar, sky that could either be sunrise or dusk. She didn't know how the story would end, but she knew it was still unfolding, because some truths arrived not in the form of words, but in the shape of a new life growing inside a woman who dared to believe again, even after everything. The streets of Chicago were dressed in early winter's haze, bare trees etched against a sky the color of steel. Elena walked them with slow, deliberate steps, a hand cradling the gentle swell beneath her coat. Her world had changed in quiet, irreversible ways. She still woke up some mornings not quite believing what was happening inside her, how life could grow so steadily even as hers felt perpetually uncertain. She hadn't spoken to Theo. Weeks had passed. She hadn't sent a message, hadn't called, hadn't reached out to say the one thing that would tear through his silence. I'm carrying your child. At first it was pride, then pain. But now it was fear. Not fear of him, but of the possibility that his reaction might confirm all the wounds she'd never truly let heal. So she said nothing. She painted instead, feverishly, obsessively. Her studio was filled with canvases of muted oceans, rain-drenched skies, and faceless figures standing alone in fields of rust and silver. Her work changed, and people noticed. The curator of a small gallery in Lincoln Park offered her a show after seeing her sketches online. He called her style raw and honest, but what he didn't understand, what no one did, was that these weren't just paintings. They were confessions. Elena titled the exhibit, Between the Tides, a phrase that had come to her late one night while staring at the ceiling. It captured the state she lived in now, between past and future, between hurt and healing, between knowing who she had been and who she was becoming. The opening was modest, intimate. The gallery was warm with the glow of amber lighting, and the air buzzed with quiet voices and the soft clink of wine glasses. Strangers wandered through her memories. They paused at her darkest corners. They lingered at her quietest hopes. She didn't expect him to walk in, but he did. Theo stood at the far end of the gallery, still and wide-eyed, wearing a charcoal coat that made his shoulders look broader than she remembered. His eyes scanned the room like he was unsure if he belonged, and for a moment she wondered if he would turn around and leave before she could speak. He didn't. Their eyes met across the room, and the noise around her vanished. He walked toward her slowly, as if the very space between them had changed since the last time they stood face to face. "I saw the article," he said quietly when he reached her. "About the show." She swallowed. "I wasn't expecting you." "I didn't think you were expecting me ever again," he replied. "But I had to come." She didn't answer. He looked around, taking in the collection. "They're beautiful," he said. "They feel like truth." That's all I had left to give. They stood in silence again until he reached into his coat and handed her something, a folded letter, worn at the edges. "What is this?" she asked. "My resignation. From Western Group." Eleanor's eyes flicked to his. He continued. "I sold my shares. Stepped down. I bought a vineyard near Charleston. I needed a place that let me be small." She stared at him, searching his face, for some indication of why he had come now, why he had done all this. "I wasn't running anymore," he said. "I wanted to be still, and I wanted to find you. But I didn't know if you'd even want to be found." 1,000 replies swelled in her chest. She could have said he was too late. She could have asked why it took him losing everything to realize what mattered. But instead she said the one thing that had lived in her chest, restless and fragile. "I'm pregnant." Theo froze, the color draining slightly from his face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "It's yours," she added, though she didn't need to. He sank onto the bench beside them, his hands trembling. "You're sure?" he whispered. She nodded. The silence stretched. Then he looked up at her with something between wonder and apology in his eyes. "I never stopped thinking about you, even when I was too much of a coward to call. I wanted to believe we had time." "We didn't," she said. "We don't." "I want to be there," he said, voice steady now. "I don't want you to go through this alone. I can't fix everything I broke, but I can show up. Every day." She believed him, and it scared her. Elena closed the gallery early that night. They walked through quiet streets, side by side but not touching, wrapped in coats and memory. Back at her apartment, he didn't ask to stay. He simply looked at her like a man trying to memorize a face he'd never thought he'd see again. "Whatever happens," he said, pausing at her door, "I'm here." Elena watched him walk away, and for the first time in a long time, her heart didn't feel like it was trying to protect itself. It felt like it was beginning to hope. In the days that followed Theo's visit to the gallery, a strange quiet filled Elena's life, not the hollow kind that echoed in grief, but the anticipatory stillness that arrives before the next breath. She returned to her routines with a calmness that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Something had shifted. It wasn't clarity exactly, but a softening. The sharp edges between past and present had begun to blur. Theo didn't call the next day, nor the day after. But on the third morning, she opened her apartment door to find a package on the threshold. Inside, wrapped in layers of tissue, was a sketchbook, the kind with linen covers and thick, textured pages. On the first page, in handwriting she recognized instantly, were just 3 words: "Start with me." There was no note, no explanation, but it was more than enough. He came back a week later. This time, he didn't come empty-handed. He brought stories of the vineyard he'd purchased near Charleston, of long days clearing land and learning how to prune vines from old men who didn't care who he used to be. He told her about evenings spent walking under the stars, trying to understand what it meant to be still in a world that always demanded motion. "You'd like it," he said as they sat across from each other in her small kitchen. "It's quiet, wild, a little broken." "Like us," she said before she could stop herself. His smile was slow, sad. "Exactly like us." They spent hours talking, not about the baby, though that was always there, an unspoken weight between them, but about themselves, the real versions, the ones stripped of performance. Elena told him about her father, a man who had taught her how to hold a paintbrush and walk away from people who couldn't see her worth. She told him about the time she broke her ankle at 12 and still tried to compete in her school's art competition because she thought failing was worse than falling. Theo listened, not like someone waiting to respond, but like someone hearing her for the first time. "I want to do this with you," he said finally, voice thick with something more than certainty. "Not because of obligation, but because when I picture the future, you're in it." She looked down at her hands now, subtly fuller from pregnancy. "This doesn't erase the past." "I know," he said, "but I'm willing to build something real from it." Elena nodded, her throat too tight for words. They started slowly. He didn't move in, and she didn't ask him to. Instead, he visited, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight, sleeping on the couch at first, then in her bed only when it no longer felt like a question. He went to doctor appointments, sitting beside her as the ultrasound flickered with the unmistakable shape of their child. He held her hand when the technician said the heartbeat was strong. He cried when he saw the tiny outline of a face for the first time. "Twins," the doctor announced one day, his voice calm and clinical. Elena had laughed in disbelief. Theo had gone pale, but then he turned to her, eyes wide, and said, "Double, or nothing, I guess." Life didn't fix itself. There were hard conversations about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about money and fears and family. Theo's younger sister, Maren, sent a letter after months of silence, offering cautious congratulations and a plea to reconnect. Elena encouraged him to answer. Family mattered now more than ever. One afternoon, as spring crept into the city, Theo brought her back to Charleston. They stayed in a modest inn near the water. Not the house they had once shared. Not yet. This trip wasn't about nostalgia. It was about intention. On their second night, they returned to the same cafe where they had first met. The table by the window was open, as if waiting for them. Theo ordered the same coffee. Elena smiled at how familiar it all felt. He reached into his coat and pulled out a velvet box. "This isn't about righting a wrong," he said as he opened it, revealing a simple gold band with no diamonds, no flourish. "This is about asking for the chance to do it right. Will you marry me again, Elena Brooks?" Her eyes filled before her lips could form words. She nodded, then whispered, "Yes." They didn't plan a grand wedding. They didn't need one. The first time had been a gesture of defiance. This time it was a promise born of choice. They returned to the small chapel near the harbor, the same one that had once been a backdrop to their foolish escape. The same minister was still there, older now, but he remembered them with a wry smile. "No veil this time," he joked. "No hiding," Elena replied. The ceremony was quiet, attended only by a few close friends, Theo's sister, and the gallery curator who had become a kind of family. Elena wore a cream-colored dress that flowed gently around her growing belly. Theo wore a navy suit with no tie, just a sprig of lavender in his pocket. When they exchanged vows, neither spoke from a script. "I vow to stay," Theo said. "Even when it's hard. Even when I'm scared." "I vow to tell the truth," Elena said. "Even when it hurts. Especially when it matters." When the officiant declared them husband and wife, they didn't kiss immediately. They simply held each other, their foreheads touching, their breath mingled. Later that night, they sat on the dock behind the inn, watching the tide roll in. Elena leaned her head on Theo's shoulder. "We've been so many things to each other," she said. "Strangers, partners, mistakes." He turned to her, brushing her hair back. "Now we're something else." She smiled. "We're home." The final months of Elena's pregnancy unfolded in quiet rhythms. Life had taken on a texture, neither soft nor harsh, but somewhere in between, measured, grounded, real. She and Theo lived most days in Charleston now, settling into a rhythm that was neither fantasy nor the chaos of their earlier days. It wasn't perfection, but it was theirs. The vineyard turned out to be more than a retreat. It became their labor of love. Theo spent his mornings among the vines, learning from seasoned hands, soil under his nails, sun on his back. It was the first time he had ever built something that didn't involve boardrooms or bottom lines. Here, everything grew slowly and demanded patience. Here, life wasn't about control, but about care. Elena watched him transform. Not into someone new, but into the version of himself she suspected had always existed beneath the armor of legacy and pressure she painted in a converted barn at the edge of the property. The light was golden in the late afternoons, and the quiet was rich, filled with birdsong and the distant hum of bees. Her pieces shifted again. Softer edges, warmer colors, no longer haunted by grief or fractured by betrayal. Her work had begun, to whisper of becoming. They were learning how to be a family before the babies arrived. They cooked dinner together most nights, sometimes in silence, sometimes to the backdrop of jazz or rain. They talked about everything. How to raise children, how to keep choosing each other, what forgiveness really meant when tested daily. One evening, while folding tiny clothes into drawers Theo had built himself, Elena paused, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. The babies kicked in tandem, two soft flutters against her ribs. She turned to him where he sat on the edge of the bed, lost in a manual about car seats. "I'm scared," she said, her voice trembling. "Not of being a mother, but of not being enough." Theo looked up immediately, his expression shifting. He stood, moved to her side, and placed his hands gently on her stomach. "You're already more than enough," he said. "And you won't be alone. We'll figure this out together. One mistake at a time." She let out a breath that felt like it had been held for years. There were moments when their old pain resurfaced, when she would catch herself doubting his words, or when he would hesitate before asking if she was truly happy. But each time they chose to talk instead of retreat. They had learned that love wasn't a shield. It was an agreement to return, again and again, to the center of what mattered. Then one spring night, as thunder rolled in the distance and the air hung thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth, Elena's water broke. Everything moved in flashes. Theo gathering bags, her body racked with the sharp, rhythmic waves of labor. The drive to the hospital lit by emergency lights and his whispered reassurances. He stayed by her side through every contraction, holding her hand when she cried, kissing her temple when her strength faltered. 12 hours later, 2 cries filled the room, a boy and a girl. The world shifted. Elena held them both against her, chest, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the weight of their existence. Tiny, warm, utterly real. Theo, his eyes full of awe and disbelief, couldn't stop touching them, his fingers tracing their hands, their tiny ears, their soft hair. "I didn't know I could love like this," he whispered. Elena looked up at him, exhausted and luminous. "It's terrifying, isn't it?" He nodded. "And beautiful." They named the boy Luca Jameson Weston after Theo's father. The girl was named Isla Rose Brooks, a nod to Elena's mother and the wildflower fields that surrounded her childhood home. When they brought the twins home, the house seemed to breathe with them. Each cry, each coo, each late-night feeding, weaving new life into the space. It was hard. The kind of hard that made them question everything. Sleep deprivation, the unpredictability of newborns, the constant negotiation of who needed what when. But through it all, they remained side by side. One particularly hard night, with both babies crying and Theo pacing with Isla while Elena rocked Luca, she turned to him and said, "We really did this." He looked at her, tired and smiling. "We really did." There was no applause, no grand realization. Just the slow, steady truth of a life chosen and fought for. Love, they had learned, wasn't a story of rescue or perfection. It was showing up at 3 a.m, milk-stained and aching, and still choosing to reach for the other's hand. It was forgiveness stretched out over time, not as a single act, but as a daily practice. It was naming their children after the people who had broken and built them. And it was looking into the eyes of the person who had once been a stranger across a cafe table and seeing not regret, but home. As spring turned to summer, the vineyard bloomed around them, rows of green stretching into the horizon. Elena would sit on the porch with Isla and Luca in her arms, sketching the way the light danced across the leaves, the shape of Theo's silhouette moving among the vines. She no longer wondered what could have been. She lived what was, and it was enough. The first birthday of their children arrived on a crisp October morning, the vineyard veiled in soft fog and gilded light. Autumn had painted the South Carolina countryside in hues of amber and rust, and the air carried the scent of apples, wet earth, and wood smoke. The twins, now toddling on uncertain legs, had brought a kind of fullness into Elena and Theo's lives that neither of them could have imagined back in that cafe a lifetime ago. They celebrated with a quiet gathering on the porch, surrounded by a few close friends and neighbors who had become like family. A string of white lights hung across, the beams fluttering in the breeze. Isla and Luca clapped their hands at the sight of balloons, their giggles echoing off the walls of the house that had become a home, not because of its structure, but because of what had grown inside it. Elena stood beside the long wooden table, watching Theo cradle their daughter, his hand steady at her back as she reached for the flickering candles. He looked up and caught Elena's gaze. There was something reverent in the way he smiled, as if he too couldn't quite believe they had made it this far. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the twins were sleeping, Elena stepped out into the vineyard alone. The rows stretched out in quiet symmetry, the sky a blanket of stars. She breathed deeply, letting the cool air fill her lungs, her sweater pulled tightly around her shoulders. She didn't hear Theo approach, but she felt him. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently on her shoulder. "I thought I'd find you out here," he murmured. "I needed a moment," she said, leaning into him, "just to take it all in." They stood in silence for a while, the hum of insects and distant owls their only soundtrack. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met?" she asked quietly. "All the time," he said. "And every version of that life feels dimmer." She turned to face him, his expression softened by the glow of moonlight. "I never thought I'd get here," she admitted. "Not just to this life, but to this peace." Theo nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "We earned it, every part of it." He paused, his hand lingering on her face. "You changed me, Elena. Not by asking me to be someone different, but by loving me as I unraveled and reassembled." She reached for his hand, pressing it to her chest. "And you reminded me that love doesn't have to arrive polished. It just has to be honest." The months that followed brought new rhythms. Elena's art reached a national audience after her exhibit was picked up by a gallery in New York, but she turned down the invitation to relocate. Her home was here now, among the vines beside the man she'd chosen twice with the children, who carried both her past and her promise. Theo too found meaning in the vineyard. What began as a place to escape had become a testament to his growth. He partnered with local farmers to expand operations sustainably, invested in a community school for the children of nearby workers, and quietly funded mental health initiatives for veterans, an echo of the conversations he once had with his father in rare vulnerable moments. They lived simply but not small. Their life wasn't curated for admiration. It was built for endurance. Some days were hard. There were arguments, exhaustion, and missteps. There were times when parenting overwhelmed them, or when old insecurities tried to claw their way back in. But now, they met each challenge with a kind of grace that came not from perfection, but from practice. Their marriage was no longer a shield from the world. It was a space within it where both of them could return again and again to remind each other who they were becoming. One afternoon in late spring, as Elena was cleaning up the studio, Luca wandered in holding one of her old sketchbooks. He flipped it open clumsily, pointing to a drawing of a woman standing at the edge of a shore. "Mama?" he asked. Elena knelt beside him, brushing a kiss onto his curls. "Yes," she whispered. "That was me." "Where were you going?" he asked, eyes wide. She looked down at the image. The figure stood solitary, facing the horizon, the ocean wild before her. "I didn't know," she said softly. "But I found out." That night she shared the moment with Theo, recounting it, with laughter and tears. He listened as always, with patience, his hand resting on her knee. "I think we should build that cottage," she said suddenly, referring to the old plan they once whispered about. A retreat by the water, just far enough from the vineyard, to feel like an escape, but close enough to remain tethered to their roots. Theo smiled. "A place for stories. And maybe someday for our kids' stories too." Years would pass. The vineyard would flourish. The children would grow. And the story of Elena and Theo would live in the fabric of that place. Not just in photos or names on deeds, but in the soil, in the air, in every vine that climbed toward the sun. Their love had begun in chaos, born from rupture and need. But it had grown into something rare, something steady, quiet, and unwavering. And in the end, that was the kind of love they had always longed for. The kind that stays. Elena Brooks' journey began not with hope, but with heartbreak, a betrayal that shattered the foundation of her life and sent her running from everything she once trusted. Yet in the most unexpected way, that escape became the beginning of a transformation she never could have imagined. From a chance encounter in a Charleston cafe with a mysterious stranger named Theo Weston, her life veered into a path marked by secrets, vulnerability, and ultimately redemption. At first, their union was a transaction, a temporary escape for them both. But beneath the surface of this impulsive decision, something real began to form. Trust broken and rebuilt. Love, not perfect but persistent. As truths were revealed and pain resurfaced, Elena and Theo were forced to confront who they were, what they had lost, and what they were still capable of building together. Their love story was not one of fairy tales. It was raw, difficult, and filled with missteps. But through every confrontation, every moment of silence and storm, they chose to stay, to talk, to forgive, to begin again. And that is what made their love enduring. Not that it was flawless, but that it was chosen, over and over, from a marriage built on escape to a home filled with laughter, children, and creation. Their journey is a powerful reminder that healing is never linear, that sometimes what breaks us also opens the door to the most profound forms of connection and meaning. Elena's growth, from a woman running from betrayal to a mother, artist, and partner grounded in self-worth, reflects the transformation possible when we give ourselves permission to trust again, to believe again. The lesson? Life will never come without wounds. People will disappoint us. We will fail, sometimes even ourselves. But the real test is not whether we fall, it's how we rise, whether we choose to close off or to keep our hearts open to new beginnings. Elena and Theo's story reminds us that the deepest forms of love are not born from perfection, but from the courage to be seen in our full truth and still be chosen. How can you apply this in your life today? Ask yourself where you've been, holding back out of fear. Is there a conversation you've been avoiding? A version of yourself you've been hiding? What would happen if you allowed yourself to be honest, even imperfectly? When we stop trying to control the story and start living it authentically, we create room for connection, healing, and even joy. Quiz time. What was the name of Theo and now? Elena's daughter, A. Isla Roseby, Lila Grace. Drop your answer in the comments, A or B. Let's see who remembers. What about you? What part of Elena and Theo's story moved you the most? Have you ever experienced a moment where pain led to unexpected growth or connection? Share your thoughts in the comments below so we can learn from each other. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that touches the heart. More powerful stories are coming soon.